Action. Hey guys, welcome back to Keeping It Apostolic, most edifying podcast in the world. I'm joined here today with Abuna Beshay. Thank you, Abuna, for coming onto the podcast.
That's a blessing. My second time.
Second time. Before we get started, I'd like to get to know you a little bit more. Tell us more about yourself, your story, bio.
So most of my life I was in Nashville, Tennessee. I lived a little bit in Jersey, a little bit in South Carolina. And then 2 years ago, I was ordained a priest here in Dallas. So I served St. Marina's, which is the American Coptic Orthodox Church. November 10th this podcast might come out later, but November 10th will officially become a Sunday church, and Beshay will open the church for us. So yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a big step, especially in the priesthood, and may God bless and reward all of your service.
Yeah.
So today we're talking about apologetics and the faith. Before we get started on defending the faith, we'd like to talk a little bit about your journey in the faith. So for a lot of us, when we grow up, you grew up in the States, we come to this crossroads in life where we have to decide whether to take our faith seriously or to kind of just be wishy-washy in it and forget about it and, kind of just go through the motions. So what was that time period or that moment in your life that kind of forced you to take that decision, to make that change, to take your faith seriously? So talk us through kind of that time period or moment in life.
Yeah, in general, I would say it's extremely important to start at a young age, like teaching our kids from a young age to take their faith seriously, because I speak to so many people nowadays where they say my sibling or my friend or whoever doesn't really care about Orthodoxy. They just want to get married to anyone, it doesn't matter if they're Muslim or atheist or whatever. They just want to go, move forward with their lives and just have a good life, and their faith isn't central to their lives. So we really have to have kids rooted from a very young age. For me, one thing that really helped was my family. We would, at a young age, every day we would have dinner together, and then we would read the Bible together. We would sit around, read the Bible, the lives of the saints. So that was just a consistent thing throughout my childhood. So it made me love God, the church, the Bible from a very young age. I had really good Sunday school servants. But then when I was in college, that's when I would say I really started to take my faith seriously. Maybe in high school, because intellectually in high school, me and my friends, we had a friend who was Egyptian, but he was Coptic Protestant, not Coptic Orthodox, so evangelical. And that forced us to actually think about our faith, because we had to have answers for him. He had so many Bible verses memorized and so on. Protestants do a good job memorizing the Bible. But we would go to our Sunday school teacher and say, how do we respond to this? How do we respond to that? And so that piqued an interest, at least intellectually, into how to defend the faith. Why are we Orthodox? Why are we Christian? And then again in college, my major was physics, which is filled with atheistic people. And so I really had to come to grips with why am I Orthodox? And that's what we do for young kids, is when they're young, we tell them what to believe, and it's the faith of their parents. When they get a little bit older, they have to realize or understand, why do I believe what I believe? So not just what do you believe, but why do you believe it? So for me, that was my journey, just kind of trying to know why I believe what I believe.
So talking a little bit about that, why do we believe what we believe? If you could summarize it in a very short or long, it doesn't matter, honestly. If you could just summarize, why do we believe the things that we believe in? Why do we believe as Orthodox Christians what we believe in?
Systematically, you could start with, okay, does God exist? And, you can give arguments for God's existence. You can look at arguments against God's existence and try to give answers. Like the most famous arguments against God's existence is probably the problem of evil. So why would an all-good, all-loving God allow evil to exist in the world? Like kids with cancer, or even natural disasters like hurricanes and so on that can kill people. Why would God allow that? And I won't go into a lot of details, but after that, after you say, okay, God does exist, I have good arguments for God's existence, the next step logically would be to ask, which God is it? And you can look at the categories of theism, monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, and so on. It's very easy from that point, in my opinion, to see that monotheism is the only one that makes sense. And then you have three options: Islam, Judaism, or Christianity. And the best, so that's like one locus, is does God exist? And then after that, why is Christianity true? And we can give arguments for the historicity of the resurrection, why, looking at the life and the person of Jesus. And then after that, if you say, okay, Christianity is true, then you have the denomination question. which denomination is it? Which denomination is the original form of Christianity? And then you can look at Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Protestantism. So that's kind of like, the systematic way of doing it. But what I would recommend is whatever comes naturally. Like what I was just telling you about high school. I didn't go through this like linear series of does God exist and so on. It was just my friends happened to be a Protestant, so I took that route, and I learned how to answer those questions first. So whatever happens organically is what I would recommend. Just using conversations and friendship.
I really like the point you made about like the opportunities that are given to you. That's how you learn. Like I know for myself in high school, like it wasn't the question of Protestant or like Orthodox or Catholicism, but it was the question of does God exist? For me personally,
In high school?
In high school, yeah.
Okay.
Where people would like ask that question, and you have to figure out like, okay,
what year were you in high school?
Like sophomore, junior year.
No,
right
I mean like what years? Like 2012? Or?
Oh, no. I was in high school like when I graduated high school like 2 years ago. This would have been like 2021,
the
2022.
The reason I'm asking is because like around 2012 time, there was something called the New Atheism. Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. These people, they were called the Four Horsemen of the New Atheism. The old atheism, like in the 1900s, was like Bertrand Russell, Albert Camus, John Paul Sartre. And that was more of an intellectual atheism. The new atheism became really popular in the 2010s. So that's why I thought maybe... but now it's kind of died off. Like now, I feel like more people are religious nowadays than 10, 15 years ago.
Of course. No, in 2012, I was 7 years old. So I was in second grade. But no, so like that question of does God exist? Like... And the point you made, like the main argument against God's existence is, why is there evil in the world if God is all good, all knowing? So I wanted to get your thoughts and your answers to that question. Why, like, how can a good, loving God exist with all of these things that go on in the world?
You always have to look at what is the purpose of life. If the purpose of life is human happiness, then it doesn't make sense why God would allow so much suffering. But if the purpose of life is for us to know God and to have a relationship with Him, then it might be a life that's completely suffused with suffering, and that might be the optimal life to bring us to a knowledge of God and a relationship with God. So the purpose of life is not human happiness. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and by the way, whenever you give a defense for this problem of evil, it's called a theodicy. So one of the most famous theodicies that we can give is the free will defense of why God allows evil in the world. And the free will defense essentially says that if we don't have free will to reject God and turn away from God, which can lead to evil and suffering and pain, whether it's natural disasters or human evil and suffering, then we can't really have the goodness and truly love God. Like, you can't have real goodness if you don't have true evil. You can't truly and freely love God if you don't have the opportunity to reject God. Like if someone has a robot wife, they just push a button and she says, "I love you." Does that mean anything? It's a robot. She has to say whatever she's programmed to say. But if you have a true loving relationship, then there's a possibility of it not working or working. She could love you. She could not love you. Your kids can love you. They could not love you. But because there's that potentiality of someone rejecting you, there's also the potential of them actually loving you. So God, when we define His omnipotence, meaning omnipotence means God is all powerful. When we define that, typically it's defined in the way that we say God can do all things that are logically possible. Something that's not logically possible, like for example, a round square. A square is not round, right? So can God create a round square?
No.
Yeah, the answer would be no, because it's not a real thing.
Yeah.
So it's not an infringement or a lack in His power. It's simply a meaningless combination of words, round, square.
Yeah.
So God can't create it, not because He's not omnipotent and He's not all-powerful, but because it's not a real thing. And so can God force people to freely love Him? If He's forcing, they're not freely loving Him. So it's a logical contradiction. So for God to give us the true, to have a true loving relationship with God, we have to have the possibility of turning away from God as well.
There's two things I wanted to like ask about in what you said. The first thing was when you say like the purpose of life is not human happiness. That's a very common, I think, misconception in today's world, that life is about happiness. How can we as Orthodox Christians, you know, like the people around us in our lives who aren't necessarily Christian or Orthodox, or even Orthodox Christians who think that this could be the case or could be true, how can we kind of redirect our own mindsets and the mindsets of others to realize that maybe the purpose of life is not just to be happy all the time? That's the first thing, and then we'll talk about the second thing.
I think people through life's experiences realize that maybe the things that give us temporary happiness don't give us true happiness or true joy. Like, you know, even if a lot of people try to retire young and, you know, be financially independent, and then what are you going to do with the rest of your life? Just be on vacation for 70 years, you know, just sitting in the sun? Like, what are you going to do? So you have to have purpose and meaning to life. And a lot of times, it's like if you're seeking something directly, you won't find it. If you're seeking happiness, you won't find it. It's like if you run after your shadow, what happens? Your shadow runs away from you. But if you're running away from your shadow follows you. Same thing with happiness. When you're seeking happiness directly, it evades you. When you're seeking a relationship with God, and people will come to see this experientially, the byproduct can be happiness and joy. And so the purpose of life is, if God created us, so there's if assuming God exists and assuming He created us, then He's the one that has to tell us our purpose. If I created this desk, then I, as the creator, will say the purpose of this desk is to function as, XYZ. So the creator and the designer of something is the one that gives it its purpose. If God created us, He designed us, then He is the one that gives us our purpose. Someone can come up, like an atheist, someone that doesn't believe in God, can say the purpose of my life is to make it to the NFL or whatever. But that's a subjective purpose. An objective purpose that's independent of humans, it's just the actual purpose of human life, can only come from God. And again, the purpose of life is to come to know God, to make Him known to others, but to have a loving relationship with Him and to live with Him forever. Not human happiness here on earth. Yeah.
The second thing of what you said that I wanted to ask about was, you mentioned like the free will, and you mentioned that, what was it? You mentioned that like for God, like God has to allow us to love Him in order for us to like actually love Him. Or like you talked about like the round square, and how things that are not logically possible cannot be done by God. Just to play devil's advocate, aren't there because there are things that God does that are outside of our logic, outside of our understanding. So let's say like you make that point of, you know, God can only do things that are logically true or logically
and
possible.
Not all Christians have believed that historically, by the way. I think it was Rene Descartes who believed that God's omnipotence includes things that are logically impossible. If you take like a philosophy course in college, a lot of the atheistic philosophy professors will give this to like freshman philosophy students, and they'll say, "Can God create a stone so heavy that even He can't lift it?" And if you say yes, then He can't lift it. If you say no, then He can't create it. And so God's not omnipotent in either scenario. But again, a stone so heavy that an omnipotent being wouldn't be able to carry it is not a real thing. There is no stone that's so heavy that an omnipotent being wouldn't be able to carry. So it's a meaningless combination of words. So if you say God can't do a logical impossibility, then He can't create that stone, because that stone is a logical impossibility. If you say He can do logical impossibilities, then you can say yes, He can create it, and He can lift it, even though it's too heavy for Him to lift, because He can do logical impossibilities. So in either case, however you define God's omnipotence, there's no infringement on His omnipotence. It's kind of confusing, but
it is a little confusing, yeah, because you always hear that like for example, like the foolishness of God is wiser than men. So this idea of like we could understand everything that God could and couldn't do, like, isn't necessarily very true. I feel like.
Say that again.
Like the possibility of us understanding what God can and can't do it's like he can and can't, like he can do more than we can understand that he could do.
Yeah, and that's why we can define God's omnipotence, but it could be beyond our scope of even understanding it. Like, God is so much more knowledgeable than we are. It's like if I see a little ant on the ground and I try to teach it calculus, like, is there any chance that ant will ever learn calculus? There's no way on earth. And it's the exact same thing times infinity with us and God. And so even things like the Trinity, we can try to explain the Trinity, and we can show that it's not logically incoherent. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 persons in one God, or 3 hypostases in one God. It's not a logical contradiction. We can explain that to Muslims or atheists when they have questions, but at the same time, we don't fully comprehend it. So there's stories of church fathers where they try to understand everything, and like St. Augustine, where the little kid told him, "Can you put the entire ocean in a little cup?" That's like trying to understand God with our very limited human mind. We're trying to teach an ant calculus. It just, God is so far above. He's not illogical, but he's beyond logic. The Trinity is beyond logic.
So what is the balance between faith and trying to intellectually understand, like, who God is and the logic and all that? Like, where does that balance?
That's a good question, because we can get sucked into a pure intellectual life, and Christianity is so much more than that. The famous phrase is "come and see," and you experience God. So the most important thing is our relationship with God. You can find a simple old lady who's never heard of philosophy or arguments for God's existence, and she could be a saint and have an amazing relationship with God. So the way we know that God exists is experientially, because I experience God in my life. The arguments for God's existence can be like the icing on the cake, confirmation of what I've already experienced. But in any world religion or philosophy, it's always about, the philosophy, the teachings of that religion, or a certain way of life. Like if you look at Islam or Buddhism, and also if you look at the major figures of each religion, the major figure in Islam is Muhammad, the Prophet. Buddhism, it's Buddha. Confucianism, it's Confucius. In Christianity, it's Christ. And I heard one person say something kind of funny. He said, if you take all of those the major person out of those religions, you kind of don't have those. You can still have the religions. Like if Muhammad wasn't there could have been another prophet, but you still have the religion. If Buddha wasn't there, someone else could have been enlightened and came up with Buddhism and so on. But in Christianity, if you take Christ out of Christianity, or Christian, he said you're left with the letters I-A-N, and Ian can't help you. So Christ is central to Christianity because it's a relationship with God that's first and foremost. Not a set of beliefs, not even a way of life, but literally the relationship with God, with Christ, his Son, with the Holy Spirit who guides us. So it's a relationship with God that's first and foremost in Christianity. And the intellectual stuff can be an aid or a help. But that's the most important thing, is my relationship with God, coming to know God.
So if the relationship with, I'm just playing a devil's advocate, but if the relationship with God is the most important thing, what is even the purpose or the point in these intellectual pursuits of understanding who God is?
Well, like I said, it can be confirmation of what I believe experientially, of what I have experienced, and then it can also help other people. Like some people will make a distinction between knowing that God exists and showing others that God exists. So knowing God exists, maybe I've experienced God, I don't need these arguments, but it could be just secondary confirmation for me. But for me to explain to other people, I can't tell them what I've experienced. It's like if I eat a fruit that neither one of us has tried, I can taste it and try it for myself and then try to explain it to you, but is it going to do you anything? You have to try it for yourself. So that's how subjective experiences work. My relationship with God, my experience with God can only really help me, but I need other people to either experience God themselves, or I can use these intellectual arguments to help bring them to God. And this is very important when it comes to like atheism and proving God exists and why Christianity is true. And it's very important as well in looking at the Christian denomination of Orthodoxy. So that's another thing that I would say from a very young age. Like my dad would, maybe even in elementary school, but definitely in middle school, would explain the differences between Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestants. At least like, for a little kid, like just at least the basics. So this is another point that's very important. Is to know why God exists, why the Christian faith is true, and then why Orthodoxy is true.
So moving into that direction of why Orthodoxy is true, what is it about Orthodoxy that you cannot find in any other Christian denomination?
The best way to frame it, in my opinion, and I speak to so many people that are interested in Orthodoxy, that are Protestants or Catholic, and some of them have never heard of Orthodoxy. It's been called America's best kept secret for a long time, which at first can be like a compliment, but then after a while, it's kind of annoying that we're still not doing a good job making Orthodoxy known to others. Excuse me. But in Christianity, what we want to do is say, what is original Christianity? What is the original form of Christianity? And you have three options. It's the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, or the Protestant Church. There's non-denominational, but it's essentially Protestant. And what you want to do is say, okay, the oldest churches are the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. They're the ones that are, we can say they're 2,000 years old. Like Rome goes all the way to the very beginning. And the framework I would explain why Orthodoxy is true in is addition and subtraction. And I'll explain what that means. The Catholic Church is just as old as we are, 2,000 years old, but they've added so many extra beliefs. Purgatory, instead of heaven and hell only, there's a third place called purgatory where you go and purge your sins for thousands of years. You're tortured, and then you can go to heaven after. Papal infallibility. The Pope is infallible when he speaks on matters of theology or ethics. The primacy of Peter. Transubstantiation, the filioque, the Latin term filioque, which means and the Son. We say the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. They say the Father and the Son, which is adding to the Bible, adding to the Creed. So they have all of the original beliefs, but they added too many extra man-made traditions. And the Protestants, when they first started, in 1517, Martin Luther, he was a Catholic monk, and he went to Rome. He visited Rome, and he saw all of the corruption. Monks living with nuns in the same house, same bed, and the pedophilia and the money, and you have to donate so much to the church so that you can get this much time out of purgatory, and all of the corruption that was going on, and all of the extra man-made beliefs that weren't there from the very beginning. He noticed both of those, and you know the phrase "throw the baby out with the bathwater." Have you heard that? Like if you're giving a baby a bath, you're supposed to throw out the dirty water, but you might accidentally throw out the baby with the bathwater. So it's a phrase that means when you're getting rid of the bad, you also get rid of the good. He got rid of all of the extra beliefs that came with the Catholic Church and all of the corruption. And what we would have wanted him to do is go back to Orthodoxy, which has the original faith without all of the extra beliefs. But he not only got rid of all that, he also got rid of the Eucharist and confession and priesthood and the liturgy and the altar. So now when you look at a Protestant church, why wake up early and go to church if all it's going to be is a sermon and praise songs, and there's no body and blood of Christ? And again, I'm not bashing Protestants or Catholics. I'm talking about ideas. The people can be great people. They can do great work. We can learn from their evangelism and the academic work. Like, they do a lot of good work. But I'm talking about ideas here, and what is the true original form of Christianity? Why is it the Orthodox Church? Because the Catholic Church added too many man-made traditions, and the Protestant Church subtracted too many things, including things that were there from the very beginning. So that's 2-minute summary of why Orthodoxy is the original form of Christianity.
I really love that, and I think even if you just look at the word orthodox and what it means, like ortho is straight. So it's just the straight path, like or straight glorification, because the doxa is doxa.
Doxology.
So there's a direct line straight up to Saint Mark and to the apostles and to Christ. So I think that's where orthodoxy is just like you said. There's no addition, there's no subtraction. It just is what it is. And right before this podcast, I had a podcast with Owen and Victor. We're talking about the developments of the liturgy and how the church is a living church and a breathing church, and there's like a natural progression of things. And so I think there's a distinction to be made from addition, subtraction, and just a natural progression of like development of liturgical worship. What do you think that difference is between like adding things to the faith versus just like a change of language or instrument or whatever? And where do you think that line is between things that are changeable and not changeable?
So dogma, or what we can call dogmatic theology, is something that we can't change. So the expression of faith can change. Like, for example, we believe in the Trinity, and the apostles believed in the Trinity. So like St. Paul, St. Peter, St. John, they believed in the Trinity. But for example, if you would ask them, about the word homoousios or hypostasis, or any of these words, hypostasis, ousia, physis, they wouldn't even know what you're talking about, because they believed in the Trinity, but the expression of the Trinity, or the expression of the faith, developed so that we could respond to heresies in the context. So the church fathers, they hammered out theologically what those original expressions of faith meant. So maybe in more nuanced or technical language. But the actual faith itself can't be altered. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when it comes to dogmatic theology, obviously we can't, change the faith. Like, the most central beliefs would be that God exists, God is a Trinity, Jesus Christ died for our sins. All of these things, we can't change. And then when it comes to tradition, and by the way, sometimes people pit the Bible and tradition against one another. So, like Protestants will say sola scriptura, by scripture alone, and they don't want anything to do with tradition. If it's not in the Bible, they don't want to hear it. And Catholics will sometimes respond saying, well, we need scripture and tradition. The way we would look at it as Orthodox actually is everything is tradition. There's the written tradition, which is scriptures, and then the oral tradition. And this is all capital T tradition that we received from the fathers. And then there's little t tradition, and this could be the differences that aren't as important or different from one church to another. Like, if you look at the Indian Orthodox Church, how they chant and how they pray and how they dress and how they do certain things is completely different from the way we do it, or a third church like the Ethiopian Church. Like, for example, in the Indian Orthodox Church, the priest can bless the censer and then give it to a deacon, and he can go around censing, where in our church only the priest can cense. So these are small t traditions that aren't as important. And then when looking at the Coptic Church itself, there's always been development of language. Like, for example, when we first received the liturgy from St. Mark, did St. Mark speak Coptic?
No.
Obviously not. He spoke Greek, and all the educated people in the world spoke Greek. So when he came to Alexandria, it was a Hellenized city, like a Greek-influenced city, and so everything was in Greek for hundreds of years. St. Cyril, the reason we call St. Cyril's liturgy the St. Cyril liturgy, it was, even though St. Mark is the one that gave it to us, is because he translated it from Greek to Coptic. He expanded on it, and he wrote it down. Instead of just simply being oral, he wrote it down. That was the first time we had a Coptic liturgy, like 400 years after the fact. And it remained for 14 centuries in Alexandria, only in Greek. And it became, there's 14 dialects of Coptic. So even when it made it down to the southern parts of Egypt, there was different variants. Now we have a form of the Coptic liturgy, for example. But what we want to do for our children is give them the best of both worlds, is allow them to preserve the Coptic heritage and the traditions and the hymnology and the architecture and the art and so on, while at the same time having an evangelistic heart and bringing people into the church. Because if you look at any immigrant community, if it's the Chinese coming to America, or the Jewish people, or the Italians, or whoever, or the Egyptians, the first 1 or 2 generations are kind of like a cocoon mentality. And eventually, it becomes a butterfly. They spread their wings and they can fly and bring people into the church. So what we want to do, like, for example, I serve at an American Coptic church. What we want to do is preserve the Coptic heritage, because we are a Coptic church. We're not, Indian Orthodox or Ethiopian Orthodox. We are a Coptic church after all, so we have to preserve the Coptic heritage. But at the same time, raise our kids with an evangelistic heart, where they know how to defend the faith and they can invite their friends into the church. And we can grow the church and be a witness to God and Orthodoxy. So that's what I call the best of both worlds model, is preserve the Coptic heritage, but at the same time have an evangelistic heart.
So talking a little bit more about that future and about the future of the church and generations, there's currently a big swing into Orthodoxy, albeit a little bit more of Eastern Orthodoxy, but in general there's a big push for Orthodoxy in the Western world. Where do you think the role of apologetics in defending your faith, what role does that play in the next 20, 30 years as this pendulum continues to swing over towards Orthodoxy?
it's extremely important because, again, the word apologetics means to give a defense. So Christian apologetics is giving a defense for why Christianity is true. Someone can do Muslim apologetics and they can explain why Islam is true. And the word apologetics comes from apologia in the Greek, like 1 Peter 3:15. Always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. So that word defense is apologia. And it doesn't just have to do with defending why I'm Christian, but also why I'm Orthodox. So, of course, it's extremely important because, at least in the Western world, all people have ever known is Protestant and Catholic. So when they find out that there's a third option that's an original church, as old as the Catholic Church, we're both 2,000 years old, but without all the extra man-made traditions, Protestants are like overjoyed. So a lot of people that I talk to that are Protestant, that are learning about the Orthodox Church, are just amazed that they've never heard of this, and they've never heard of the early church fathers, and that early on, people believed that it was the true body and blood of Christ. There was confession, there was priesthood. All of these things existed. So if you look at the 12 disciples and the 70 apostles, all of them went to the rest of the world preaching, and each of them had a group of disciples. So if me and you are arguing over John chapter 6, for example, why just have it be my word versus your word? Why not look at the writings of St. Ignatius of Antioch, for example, who was a disciple of St. John the Beloved? He lived with St. John for like 20 years. He knows what John chapter 6 means, obviously. And he wrote 7 letters before he died. And these weren't like bishops, like in the Protestant church nowadays where they're, flying in jets and making millions of dollars. He was willing to lay his life down. He went to Rome and was killed in the Colosseum. So he wrote, and if you read, and he died in 107 AD or 110 AD. So very early on, they lived with the disciples, and you can see what they themselves believed about John chapter 6, for example, just to give one example. So it's important to understand apologetics and explain to our kids why we believe what we believe, because it's good for them so that they don't leave the church. And then when they invite people into the church, we can have answers of why we're Orthodox. Because if it's the true expression of Christianity, it's the fullness of Christianity, then of course it's extremely important. And again, like when I think about a Protestant that wakes up early Sunday morning to go to church, and you don't have the body and blood of Christ, like what are you going to church for? Like to sing songs and listen to a sermon? Does that make any sense? How can you not have the true body and blood of Christ? So to reject what Christians have believed for 1,500 years, and actually just to give the Eucharist example, if you look at Martin Luther himself, the great Protestant reformer, like the idol of all Protestants, he himself still believed in the true presence of the body and blood of Christ. And he wrote about Zwingli and the people he called the radicals. He said, I would rather drink raw blood with the Pope, they don't like the Catholic Pope, than mere wine with the fanatics. Martin Luther said this. Imagine, if a Protestant nowadays knew that Martin Luther said that.
Yeah.
So it's very important to know the differences between the different denominations, why we believe what we believe, and most importantly, what did the early church believe before there was time for any extra beliefs to be added or subtracted. It doesn't matter because we all use the Bible to argue. The whole point is which interpretation of the Bible is correct, because every heretic in history has used the Bible to prove their point.
I mean, every heretic was like well educated.
Yeah.
Like Arius was like a priest.
And what was Arius doing? Like he was using the Bible. He said,
exactly.
Only the Father knows this, and all these verses that he was misusing and misunderstanding, but he was using the Bible to prove his point. And so it's not enough to use the Bible. It's whose interpretation of the Bible is. And the one that we want is not mine or yours or whoever's. Go back to the early church, see how they understood the Bible. The disciples of the disciples, which is what we call the early church fathers.
Well, thank you, Abuna, for your time and coming onto the podcast.
It was a blessing.
Anything else that you wanted to add on or say as we close?
Just the last thing I said, which is we want to give our kids the best of both worlds, to preserve the Coptic heritage, to love Orthodoxy, but at the same time have an evangelistic heart and not have this cocoon mentality. If we want to think about 20 years from now, when you have like a 15-year-old by that point, how do we want them to act? Do we want them to be able to invite others into the church and have that evangelistic heart, or still have this cocoon mentality? And so, with God's grace, we can all learn more and be able to share the faith with others.
Well, thank you, Abuna, again for your time on this podcast. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, turn on post notifications. See you guys next week. Thank you.